If we talk about foot position, then footwear, the climbing shoe we have on our foot, will also be relevant because this dictates how well we can use a given foot position. Now, the intended purpose of a climbing shoe really focuses on the crux foothold and our ability to best exploit that to finish out a sequence. But the reality is most climbing shoes can function well across a wide variety of terrain. And so some are hyper specialized where they may have some obvious advantages and disadvantages, but again, the majority of climbing you could do in the majority of shoes. There are several ways we describe climbing shoes, and some of them are quite simple and reductionist. First one I want to focus on is that aggressiveness continuum. So we often say a shoe is neutral, moderate, or aggressive. The reality is there's definitely some very highly aggressive shoes, and there's some very relaxed fit shoes, and there's a whole swath between. So I've got my most aggressive shoe here with the previous generation of the Scarpa Mago to best demonstrate the four characteristics of aggressiveness. First thing you might notice is a highly downcambered shoe, so it's got a very obvious angle through the arch. That's going to flex my foot to help me reduce the angle of that lever so I can pull into the wall a little bit more easily, plus get my toes back behind a foothold on steeper terrain a little bit more readily. Now be mindful, as I step into this shoe, no shoe is tensioned and structured enough to ever resist my body weight, so it will flatten out, and really you still need to flex your foot and not rely on this shoe. The shoe will support me in doing that and more readily hold that position, but it doesn't do it for me by any stretch. Then we can look at asymmetry of a shoe, so how off this initial line it is. That asymmetric profile packs all the toes together into the big toe. So especially as footholds become a little smaller and we become a bit more precise, we're applying more power just through the big toe. Those other toes get to support it, so it doesn't want to buckle off there as we're mid-stand on that hold. Then we can look at the angle of the toe box. This is a very high angle toe box. It means that my toes are meant to be pulled back into more of a crimp-like position, so I can exploit that small in-cut on some smaller edges and such, especially on steeper terrain. Then we've got our heel tension. So this is both the ability to resist that deformation, how hard it's been tensioned into my heel, as well as the angle that it drives into the Achilles. And that especially will hold my foot into the position that the designer intended, which in this case, as you kind of see, is a very tense, high angle, crimp-like edging machine that I would call this. That's what I use this for predominantly. Now, how else would we describe a climbing shoe? Well, there's people that might describe one as for bouldering or sport. And while there's not a lot of boulders that I use my Scarpa Mago on, the reality is every shoe you see and every shoe that I bring with me, I've used on sport climbs and boulders, and I don't use different sizes of my footwear for either. I could be working a project for 45 minutes on a rope, come down and want to come out of my shoes, or I can take a minute-long burn on a boulder, and I'm still going to want to come out of my shoes anyway. So I would say that's a bit too simplistic, and especially if you're talking about rubber over tops of the toes. Well, the Mongo has more rubber than a lot of previous generation of climbing shoes did. The Fury Air has a good amount, but it's by no means that huge swath. The Chimera is exceptionally coated over the toe, but that's going to be more for if I'm toe hooking or I've got a crux toe hook, I might pull out the Chimera for that purpose. So not a bouldering or a sport shoe. And then we might hear someone describe something as stiff or soft. The reality is that's also quite simplistic, and there's four characteristics I might describe. Let me get a couple shoes out, and if you look at the base of these things, the first you might notice is a difference in rubber. So this is excess edge rubber, this is excess grip 2, and this excess grip 2 will be a bit stickier rubber. And so what that means is if the hold is less distinct, or I really need more rubber down to catch the hold, then this will deform a little bit better in there. Whereas this rubber, excess edge, will seize up a little bit better on things like small crystals and points, where really what I want to do is drive as much force through a very minuscule point as possible, but have the shoe support me well. Whereas on a softer rubber, that rubber might start rolling off the hold. So we're going to be talking about just the stickiness of the rubber or how much it seizes up. Then we've got the actual support of the shoe. You might have noticed that this has a full-length rubber outsole. That's going to provide me a little bit more support. It's also got the midsole underneath. This one happens to go the full length, versus a lot of these shoes that won't go anywhere near full length, so it's less supportive because it's a bit more flexible. So especially steeper terrain, where I need a bit more mobility through my arch, this gives me that, versus if I'm on rather steep terrain, versus rather vertical to off vertical terrain, this gives me a little bit of support as I drive an awful lot of weight through my toes repeatedly. My foot will fatigue. This provides me a bit more support with that. Then the next two things are going to be the structure of the toe box. So that's going to be especially more on things like pockets or some of wider edges where we're rolling across them. How well does the shoe resist that deformation there? And this is the Fury Air. It's not a really well structured toe box because you can see how well I can flex it. Well, that means I can be really agile with my toes, wrap them around just like I would be using my hand around some talons and things like that. So especially a lot of board climbing, I use the Fury Air an awful lot to be very agile. It's not very structured though. Whereas the Boot Stick has a much better structured foot. So especially things like pockets where maybe I don't get to stand into the bottom of the pocket, but I just need to have it wedged into and stand through that. Booster plays quite well, as does the Mago. This does not want to flex much at all. So that's going to be its structure of the toe box. And then I already mentioned the midsole a little bit, but midsole is going to be really how stiff the toe is itself. There's going to be a plastic insert underneath the rubber that fits usually underneath the big toe, and then depending on how stiff it is, how thick it is, where it's been placed, how it's been manufactured so that it seizes up in certain ways. They're all a little bit different, but you'll notice with the Boot Stick, if you actually get to feel one on the outside, there's this little ridge. That's because the midsole's been rolled up and over, so when it's on an edge, it wants to seize up a little bit harder. Booster has the same thing right here. And then the Mago, the Chimera, and the Fury Air actually all have the same midsole, but the structure of the toe box changes this a little bit more. So that's going to be that rundown between stiff and soft. And you can see there are some that are stickier, more structured, more supportive, with more stiffness underneath the toe, and some that are less of all those things.